I'm here to tell my people it's time to stop believing bull just because a mother tell you bull with a straight look on their face. We too old, we too smart, we too good to believe don't make no sense. You too old to be believing in evolution with your stupid mother. Evolution say people came from monkeys. And the question is, why is there still monkeys, you dumb mother you? Is these the retarded monkeys? They didn't turn into people just yet. Get your stupid ass the fuck out of here.
The missing link, commonly thought of as a hypothetical ape-like creature. This evolutionary rock star is supposed to bridge the gap between man and ape, but there are missing links all over Darwin's evolutionary tree. And guess what? They are still missing. For instance, dogs and bears are thought to be cousins, related to each other through a missing link. The same could be said for every other gap in evolution. And some of these gaps are huge, like the gap between sea creatures with and without bones. While scientists have found fish fossils with bones and ones without, they have yet to find what goes in between. All types of animals are thought by evolutionists to have risen by the transformation of some other animal type. And as each part of the evolutionary tree branches from one type to another, there appears to be another missing link. And that's the big problem with evolution. Evolution depends on countless missing links, each of which lived in a past we can never know, and they all have supposedly gone extinct, replaced by their evolved descendants. For example, if some types of fish evolved into some types of amphibians, then there should have been a few changed along the way from 90% fish, then 80% fish, and so on until 100% amphibian emerged. But the evidence and the fish are still missing. Creation says that all life was created after its kind. We can easily see that creation has upheld that process to this day. Evolution says we have to trust that there are many unseen missing links out there. So it's plain to see that the theory of evolution is a theory full of gaps. What do you find more believable? We've all heard the theory that chimps are close human relatives, but is there any truth to that? Secular scientists claimed in the 1970s that chimp genomes are 98% similar to humans, and it was apparently verified by more modern techniques. But that estimate actually used isolated segments of DNA that we already share with chimps, not the whole genomes. The latest comparison to include all of the DNA between the two species revealed only a 70% identity, a huge difference from what scientists have been claiming for years. And a 70% similarity really isn't surprising. Chimps and humans, and even dogs, cats, horses, and more, share some basic similarities: metabolizing foods, growing hair, breathing air, and drinking water. So of course, much of the genetic material would have to be the same. But chimps don't have the intellectual abilities of humans to create or communicate, or the creative abilities in their hands. For example, they cannot build hospitals, operate on one another, play baseball, or write poetry. So it makes sense that when new research compared each chimp chromosome piece by piece to the corresponding human chromosome pieces, they were 30% different. In fact, 900 million DNA letter differences separate the two species. Far too many precise and vital bits of information for any source other than genius intelligence to generate. Chimps and humans are very different, not only in their anatomy and behavioral traits, but also in their genomes. When the entire genomes of humans and chimps are compared, it becomes clear that they were each engineered uniquely and separately by an omnipotent genius creator.
Another problem with evolutionary theory is that simple to complex vertical evolution seems to be an exception to one of the fundamental laws of physics.
Nothing hits the spot on a freezing day like a bowl of hot soup. But don't leave it out too long, because all that warm goodness will quickly escape, making it cold and unappetizing. That's science in action, by the way. It's called the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy. History credits French military engineer Sadi Carnot as the scientist who laid the foundation for the second law in his 1824 book, Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire, which talked about heat and steam engines. Scientists today use the second law to describe anything that naturally goes from a state of order to disorder, like your car. Even if you maintain it like you should, it will eventually need to be replaced. Entropy affects everything, from cells in your body to the magnetic fields of planets, which run out of energy over time, like regular magnets. That's why some scientists doubt that nature can ever make anything better through evolution, like turning bacteria into people. Plus, the Bible is clear that creation would go from order to disorder because sin and death entered the world. And that's exactly what we see happening all around us. So you'd better go ahead and eat that soup before it gets cold.
Entropy had its origins in the study of the Carnot cycle, where scientists observed that heat would move from a hot reservoir of gas to a cold reservoir of gas. And as the heat moved and the temperatures between the two reservoirs equilibrated, you could do no more work. In other words, the system went from order to disorder. Now that concept, while it's thermodynamic in its origins and its nature, has been extended into information theory to some degree as a statement that everything tends to go from order to disorder. Now, if you look at the theory of evolution, you have an interesting conundrum there, because the theory of evolution says that we went from very poorly ordered systems, one-cell systems, to extremely complicated systems, the human being, over a long period of 500 million years. That would seem to not be in agreement with the whole idea of the second law of thermodynamics.
And he's been a thinker for a lot longer than that. Ladies and gentlemen, Lloyd Pye.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that very much. A lot of what you're going to hear at the beginning now is material that is not really forbidden or hidden or anything like that, but it's very difficult to access because science, you need to understand, is involved in a very pitched battle with creationists over who decides the origins of life and the origins of humanity. The reality of it is, because of that battle, scientists are not able to say, we don't know, we don't understand. They always come up with an answer for everything, and they wait till that answer is proved wrong, and then they come up with a new answer until that one is proved wrong, and that's kind of how the system moves along from a scientific standpoint. But they never are in a position to say, we don't know, because if they do that, then the creationists will say, well, if you don't know, then you should be teaching our information equally with yours, which I'm not for and I don't think should be done. I'm not a creationist. I'm not a Darwinist. I talk about the middle ground. I explore the middle ground. I follow the facts where they lead. And what I'm going to do here in this first hour, hour and a half is lead you along that path and show you things that I think everybody needs to know. And then you can decide on your own if you want to pursue it any further through my book or any other means as time goes by. Okay? With that said, first slide, please. This is the beginning, we are told and we are taught, of life on Earth. And for all intents and purposes, life anywhere. Science says that it has to have created itself out of the natural course of events here on Earth. There can be no outside intervention, whether that be extraterrestrial or divine. Everything happens within the Earth and the Earth's mechanisms as we understand them right now today. So what it says is that simple elements like oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen form into simple compounds: carbon monoxide, water, formaldehyde, ammonia, hydrogen cyanide. And somehow these things, which are basically they're basically the way things are in the real world, somehow form themselves into much more complex molecules: fatty acids, purines, sugars, nucleotides, and amino acids. Now, the amino acids, I would point out that in the 1950s, There was great celebrating when a scientist used a lot of catalytic elements, putting gases in tubes, putting electrical charges through it, and he got a few amino acids created, and everybody celebrated and said, oh, well, that explains how life came to be. He performed one intermediate step, and he only got a few amino acids, and that's really all you ever get in those experiments. So these do not actually jump themselves together. They don't link electrons and go skipping merrily along. It's hard to put them together. But nonetheless, somehow they did it on their own, and then they did form the even more complex molecules of lipids, DNA, and protein. Now, forget all that and how difficult that is and really doesn't happen in the real world very easily. These somehow swept together and formed themselves into the first living thing. Now, imagine it. Somehow the lipids form themselves into a double membrane when they will barely clump together on the surface of water in normal circumstances. Somehow these lipids that formed this double membrane understood that they had to gather up within themselves some strands of DNA, which are not going to be found floating around anywhere. And somehow the DNA knew that to create proteins and use them, and this living cell came out knowing how to feed itself, how the membrane knew how to let nutrients seep through, the membrane knew how to let waste go out, the DNA knew how to create energy, and the cell somehow knew how to replicate itself again and again and again ad infinitum. What are the odds of it? Next slide. The odds are of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and creating a Boeing 747. It didn't happen. It couldn't happen. It's impossible. And yet here I stand talking to you, and there you sit listening to me. So something happened. Something happens. And whatever it is, I'm sure down the line we're going to find that it has laws that govern it, whatever it is. Understandable rules and regulations. But we're so far removed from that now and removed from an understanding of it that to us it's going to be absolutely supernatural. As we sit here today, whatever that answer is, totally supernatural. Next slide. What we know happened is this. The Earth coalesced out of the primordial cloud of dust and gas around 4.5 billion years ago. For the first million or so years, billion or so years rather, it was just seething lava being bombarded by meteors and asteroids. But amazingly, here at around 4 billion years ago, only about half a billion years, life appears. You see those little circles right there? Prokaryotic bacteria. Prokaryotic bacteria. And surprise, surprise, these things are invulnerable. They can live absolutely anywhere, in any kind of environment, and make it. All right? So they appear, as you see, just suddenly at a time when nothing should be there. It's just seething lava and being bombarded all the time, and yet there they survive, no problem, prokaryotic bacteria. Now, what are the prokaryotes? They are single-celled bacteria with no cell nucleus. They're very simple, but they're invulnerable, but they're very complex relative to that first cell that you saw, that first life form, that first whatever it was. It's much more complicated than that, much more complex than that. Furthermore, you would think that one, and only one, would appear if indeed there was a creation, a natural creation of the first life form on Earth, would you not? But no, it turns out in the late 1980s we discovered that there are two, not one, but two prokaryotic bacteria types that appear on Earth at around 4 billion years ago. Apples and oranges come. Not apples, not oranges, both. Now that doesn't make sense in terms of any kind of natural progression. The only answer for it, and scientists, some will admit it now, is that it came. It appeared here. It didn't develop here. There's not enough time, just absolutely not enough time. The Earth is too hostile a place, and you get two types of prokaryotic bacteria. It came here, or was delivered here. All right, so it continues on 2.5 billion years down to 2 billion years. Earth's cooled off now. The seas are pretty much the temperatures as they are today. And you get a new type of single-celled bacteria, the eukaryotes. Now, the eukaryotes have cells. They have a nucleus in their cells. So you have the prokaryotes without a nucleus, and you have the eukaryotes with a nucleus. They're also much more complex, much more sophisticated, much larger, the eukaryotes are. How are they explained by science? Science says, well, some of these prokaryotes that were large decided to eat some of the ones that were small, and the ones that were small decided to turn themselves into a cell nucleus, and that's how the eukaryotes were made. That didn't happen either. That's just absurd. The eukaryotes appear when the Earth seems ready to receive them, because they're more fragile than are the prokaryotes. So they come when the Earth is ready for them, and they too seem to be delivered. Just as with the prokaryotes, strata without, strata with, they just appear. They don't develop from anything unless you believe that story about the large prokaryotes eating the small ones. Then we continue down with just prokaryotes and eukaryotes through 1 billion years to around 600 million years ago when something called Ediacaran fauna appears. Now they are the first complex creatures, more than one cell. We don't know what they were to this day. We don't know if they were plant or animal. We really don't know what they were. So they represent them here as seaweeds and kind of jellyfish, but nobody knows what they were. And then suddenly here at around 530 million years ago, you see these two little lines right here, that little space in there, 5 to 10 million years relative to everything else. Just overnight, a blink, you have something called the Cambrian explosion. Now the Cambrian explosion was so unexpected, so improbable, so otherworldly, that really not even Darwinists pretend that it's a Darwinian evolution kind of thing. Again, things just appear. Next slide. And here it is. You have suddenly the seas being filled in that very short period of time with thousands of new plants and animals. In fact, as far as animals go, it was all 26 phyla that we have today appear in that one nuclear level explosion of life on the planet, the Cambrian explosion. And as you see, none of it looks like life on Earth. It looks like creatures from other planets, which they very likely are. The closest thing we have left to anything from the Cambrian explosion on Earth today is horseshoe crabs, and everybody knows how bizarre they look. Cambrian explosion. Next slide. So from there, we have the full panoply of life, of complex life as we know it on Earth. Now, what are we told? How do we told this happens? It goes from the sea worms turning into fish, the fish turning into amphibians, the amphibians turning into reptiles, reptiles turning into mammals and birds, by a process called macroevolution. And what that requires is for gills to turn into lungs, fins to turn into limbs, and scales to turn into skin, and whole body changes, changes in whole body parts. Macroevolution. And Darwinists insist that this happen because, again, it all happens to it has to happen within constraints that are here on the planet and be explained in terms that are understandable to them, to what they understand now. But in reality, that doesn't happen. It just simply doesn't happen that way. Macroevolution is a great idea, except there's no proof for it. There's not a single shred of definitive proof for macroevolution in 140 years of looking really hard for it. Next slide, please. What Darwin saw to come up with that idea was microevolution. Microevolution. Evolution in parts. He saw creatures on the Galapagos Islands. He saw finches, he saw tortoises, he saw others. And on different islands, they had developed different abilities, different physical abilities to go with the niches that they were in. Now, these are not Darwin's finches because the view of change in the beaks of Darwin's finches is fairly subtle. These are honey creepers from Hawaii. Hawaii is 6 million years old. The Galapagos are only 3 million years old, so they've had 3 more million years of evolution, and you see them much clearer, but it's the same principle. You have the ancestral honey creeper that goes out. You have those that feed on nectar and insects, fruit, and seeds. And so all of these birds still digest like honey creepers, still reproduce like honey creepers. They still are honey creepers. This one didn't turn into a gull or a crow or anything like that. They adapted in part, pieces, adapted in pieces, microevolution. This is what Darwin saw, and he said, well, if you can have microevolution in this little period of time, then over the grand span of time, you can have macroevolution. You can have change in whole bodies, and that was the theory. Everybody bought into that because it makes sense. It's logical. Had I been there, I would have bought into that. Most of you would have. But the problem is, Darwin himself said, if you can't find the transitional species that my theory calls for, my theory has to be wrong. And the transitional species are simply not there. Not there. I think if Darwin were standing here today, even though he's a homeboy, he would be willing to stand up and say, yeah, I made a mistake. I did the best I could under the circumstances. It just didn't work out. But because, again, Darwinists are so locked into that battle with creationists, they can't acknowledge the truth that all of them know. I know this, you can see this, a child can see this. Next slide. What really happens in the course of life is this, and this is a squeezed down version of the course of life, is that it's dominated by catastrophic events, mass extinctions, 5 of them, 5 major, what are called major, and several what are called minor. Now the majors take out anywhere from 50 to 90% of life when it happens, and it pretty much changes the environment of Earth. It's a catastrophe. And those that live, but after a period of time, and it generally is from 1,000 to a few million years, suddenly life begins to proliferate again. And it's generally a different kind of life than was here before, adapted to the new environment, whatever it is. Now, if indeed Darwinism worked, gradualism, naturalism, whatever you want to call it, it would be clearest in these periods after the extinction events, when the fossil record, for all intents and purposes, is wiped clean. It should show up, and they can read those fossil records, and what it shows is very clearly that new things just appear. Just appear. So in the 70s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge came up with an acknowledgement of this gaping hole in the Darwinian theory, and said, they put a patch on it, and the patch was called punctuated equilibrium. Now, if you want to really, really tick off a hardcore Darwinist, start talking to him about punctuated equilibrium. Why? Because it's the truth. And the truth is that things just appear. So the punctuated equilibrium theory is that when Darwinism can go slow, it goes slow, but somehow, after these extinction events, the animals that are left, the creatures that are left, the plants that are left, somehow their genes know they have to hit the accelerator and start speciating wildly into the new niches. And it's been analogized as a kernel of popcorn. A kernel would pop into its piece of popcorn under natural circumstances, and that would be its next step up the ladder of evolution. But somehow after these events, according to punctuated equilibrium, each remaining seed of popcorn, each remaining form of life, knows that it's time to pop itself into a whole big bucket of popcorn, which is absurd. It does not happen. Punctuated equilibrium is the story of what happens, and it's not gradualism, and it's not Darwinism. Things just appear here. And they appear all the way back to the prokaryotes, to the eukaryotes, to the Ediacaran fauna, to the Cambrian explosion. Everything appears. What are the odds of it? The odds are of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and creating a Boeing 747. It didn't happen. It couldn't happen. It's impossible. And yet here I stand talking to you, and there you sit listening to me.